Hello, this is Dr. Hassan Abdullah with the course Deep Reinforcement Learning. And the topic which we are covering is recursive neural networks. And this is topic number 9 in the list of topics in the course. And the subtopic is B. So this video is video 9B. And its difficulty is from easy to moderate. And this video is developed and supported by the supplemental website easymcq.com/goget, which is a personalized learning management system. So, what is the future of content delivery? That is not the future alone, that is also the present, because there are literally hundreds and millions of end users who are getting educated using the content delivery platform and mechanism, which are in hundreds and millions. So, that is the approach which is being used in delivering and explaining the concepts in this course. So, the personalized learning management system is accessible using the URL which is given in green color, and the content delivery mechanism is explained using 6 videos, and those videos are accessible using the link given in blue color. So what are those features which I've mentioned? These features consist of advanced and basic content search, which is not there in leading learning management systems. And then, of course, the ability to support people with visual disability, such as changing the font size, color, line spacing, and so on. And then this content is organized in such a way that it can efficiently use the limited speed, the limited space, and the speed of a handheld device. And of course, you can track your progress, what you have seen, done, and what you need to do. And then, of course, you also can test yourself online in real time, your knowledge assimilation and knowledge capturing. So, how the content is delivered? The content delivery can be question and answer based, and it can be traditional slides based. Now, the question and answer based approach is engaging, is proactive, it promotes thinking, and of course, it is very productive also. And the traditional approach contains a lot of details. So, the approach we have been following in this course is a blended approach, which is the best of both. So, these are the topics which are covered in this course. And the topic which is being covered in this video lecture is recursive neural networks. And these are the details of those question and answers, which are basically the concepts. So one set is shown in yellow color, and the other set or video is in green color. So now we move on to the details of that course. So this is video 9B, deep learning recursive neural networks. So we are at the concept. So how does a recursive neural net process input in a hierarchical or tree-like structure? This is an interesting question. So now recognize that uh, bottom-up composition, shared weights, and recursive representation, they basically define the operational core of recursive neural nets, which makes them well suited for processing hierarchical structures in deep reinforcement learning. Now, what each of them do is that, say, for example, bottom-up composition ensures that local semantics are integrated into higher level abstractions because it's a bottom up approach. And the shared weights reduce complexity and enforce consistency that we covered to a certain extent in convolutional neural networks. So, what it does, it makes learning more stable and data efficient. And finally, recursive representation preserves the structural nature of the input, where that enables compositional and generalizable modeling. So, in a nutshell, in deep reinforcement learning, these mechanisms help optimize over structured state, okay, over structured state and action spaces. So what it does, it supports hierarchical policy learning, planning, and decision making. So collectively, these techniques enhance the scalability, interpretability, and performance of reinforcement learning agents, which are operating in complex and structured environments. So if you look at this diagram, so we have this graph, and as you can see, This graph is it's a directed graph, okay? And then we construct a tree. So we have this tree here. This is the rooted tree, all right? And then we have a graph-based neural network. So these are the inputs, and then we have the hidden states. So we have a recursive neural net, right, which are like kind of hierarchy, and this is how the hidden state has been uh, defined. Okay, so we have been able to convert a directed graph into this is a tree. This is also a tree, but into a structure, right, and a recursive neural network. So if you go into the details of these bullets by clicking on more, so what do we get? Bottom up composition. So this process begins at the leaves of a tree structure, and it recursively combines nodes upward to form the full hierarchical representation, which is a rooted tree. Now each parent node is constructed from its child nodes using a shared function. What it does, it captures the local and the global semantics. Now this approach is the key approach for building representations that reflect the structure and semantics or meaning of the input. Now in deep reinforcement learning, it enables the agents to model complex tasks by composing or combining basically low level actions into high level strategies, which of course is essential for hierarchical reinforcement learning and planning, not for temporal. Then we move to shared weights. Now, by applying the same transformation across all levels and branches of the tree, the shared weights introduce a strong structural or a strong structure priorly that promotes consistency and generalization. So what is the benefit? This approach greatly reduces the number of learnable parameters. So when the learnable parameters reduce, the complexity and the energy requirements and the computational requirements also decrease. So that enhances data efficiency. And when there are fewer learning parameters, then there is less likely chance of overfitting. Now in deep reinforcement learning, the shared weights stabilize the learning that we have covered earlier and allow the agent to apply learned policies, as a matter of fact, or substructures across similar but different shaped environments or tasks as per the structure of the corresponding rooted trees. Now this is very important in transfer learning or meta reinforcement learning. Transfer learning means that what you have learned in one domain, you can use it and build upon it in the other domain. That is covered in the when I teach the course reinforcement learning. There's a project on it also. Now recursive representation. Now, what does recursive representation involves? It involves computing a vector at each node in a tree by merging its children and doing it recursively. So what it does, it captures the local structure and the global context also. What what it does, this enables the model to maintain the hierarchy of the input data. Now in deep reinforcement learning, it supports the task where states or actions are naturally structured. They have a natural hierarchy, such as multi-level planning or decision making. Now, recursive representations allow the agents to generalize from smaller structures to more complex configurations. And what it does, it improves the learning flexibility and the robustness. So that despite the complexity, that is a big strength of recursive neural nets. So here are the details. I would suggest that you read these details, go over them, and here are the references based upon which these details were provided. So now we move to the next Q&A, which is what are some real world applications where recursive neural networks outperform other models. So these are those applications: sentiment analysis, syntax parsing, and of course scene understanding. So as you can see, this is an example of a scene understanding. This is a rooted tree. So we have different segments, and when we combine these two to get this, combine these two with this and get this one, and ultimately we have this entire picture. So this is a very natural example of scene hierarchy. So, across sentiment analysis and syntax parsing and scene understanding, recursive neural nets are especially competitive when there is input hierarchy or compositional structure. Now, in sentiment tasks, they help resolve composition effects like negation or modifiers. So that's their application. In syntax parsing, the recursive neural nets directly model sentence structure. And in scene understanding, recursive neural nets uncover object hierarchies and inter-object relationships, as I've just shown you. So what distinguishes these domains in the presence of nested structures is the nested structures, phrases within sentences, objects within scenes. And these flat sequences models or purely convolutional ones have a difficult time modeling them. So in such settings, recursive neural nets provide structural inductive bias. As you can see that the bias is there because of the hierarchy. That often leads to better hierarchy as compared to convolutional networks or recurrent neural nets. It makes them more, it results in more interpretable representations, more stable generalization. And when there is especially limited data, we have just one scene and or weak supervision. So here, so these are the more details. So let's go over the details on sentiment analysis. In sentiment analysis, recursive models outperform flat sequential recurrent neural nets. Why? When there is compositional structure, negation, intensification, contrasting clauses, and so on. Why? Because they influence the sentiment. Now, by operating over the parse trees, recursive neural nets can capture how subphrases combine to yield the overall statement. Now, studies combining convolutional and recursive network show that using the tree structure boosts the performance on benchmarks, standard benchmarks, okay, as compared to pure CNN or pure RNN. So this recursive neural net tree representation helps in understanding the different things like modifier negation, like nested clauses better as compared to pure CNN or RNN. So that's their strength areas. And then is syntax parsing. Now, the syntax parsing benefits significantly from recursive neural nets because the data itself is tree. There's a structure to the data, and there's a tree structure. Now, recursive neural nets can explicitly model phrase structure, labeling, and segment the boundaries. For example, uh, in different languages, the recursive neural nets framework jointly handles segmentation, tree construction, and labeling tasks, outperforming methods without recursive structure. Now, recursive models align well with annotation formats used in syntax parsing. Why? Because that enables better supervised learning, and uh, and it allows capturing structural dependencies more directly than sequence models. And finally, in scene understanding, the example which is in front of you, in scene understanding, images can be parsed into hierarchical structures, objects, sub-objects, and the spatial relationships and the semantic regions can be identified. Now, recursive nets can combine region or object features recursively to build the entire scene as scene hierarchies, and they can also model inter-object relations, and they can also use what is called as the weak supervision. So, recursive networks placed on top of CNN outperform flat models like recurrent neural nets for segmentation and scene labeling tasks. So the recursive structure helps to capture semantics, object relations, and spatial hierarchies that purely flat or sequential methods will miss. That's the strength. Okay, so here are the details of what we have just discussed, and here are the references of what we have discussed. So let's take a look at the computational limitations of recursive neural networks, specifically for real-time deep reinforcement learning applications. Now, as we know that recursive neural networks are specialized architectures and they are designed to process structured hierarchical data. Of course, that's an attractive trait for modeling, say, complex states in reinforcement learning. However, in theoretically, their ability to kind of go along with the domain hierarchies aligns well with tasks like planning, language conditional reinforcement learning, or policy composition, and so on. However, there are practical computational limitations which prohibit their deployment in real time applications. So, there are five major challenges that arise because the recursive depth leads to kind of long inference cycles and gradient paths, and that increases the delays or the latency, and which results in instability. So, what are those aspects? These are the aspects I'm talking about. And the parallelism constraints stem from the sequential nature of node dependencies. That reduces the efficiency of the hardware because all of the hardware is not used all of the time. Now, these delays or higher latency due to creating that graph recursively uh, delays real time decision making, which is a critical issue in dynamic control tasks, say, for example, a driverless car. So, then is the memory overhead of recursion, which scales poorly with as the node count and increases and the rollout depth increases, especially for like multi-agent settings. So last but not the least, structural rigidity, which is as per the structure of the hierarchy of the corresponding tree, that limits the adaptability to variable tasks or environmental hierarchies. So in a nutshell, in high throughput or time sensitive reinforcement learning systems, these limitations offset the theoretical advantage of recurrent neural networks. Now, they are suitable for offline or those applications which are rich in structure, but they require like significant optimization or, in the worst case, architectural changes for real time deep reinforcement learning systems. So, this diagram here that illustrates there's a k array tree. Here, k is 3. You can see the degree is 3. And we have these inputs, okay, from x1 to x18, and then we have the outputs, and you can see that this tree will occupy a lot of memory, and when recursion takes place there's a lot of stuff goes on the stack. So this is memory intensive. So and when this recursion is kind of unfolded and so on, so you can look at the complexity of the problem. So let's look at this in more detail. So let's look at the recursive depth. So the recursive depth means that many layered recursive operations are there, which slows down the forward and backward passes, and it like kind of increases the gradient path or elongates the gradient path. Okay, so this directly translates to slower decision making, slower training, uh, especially when the time is critical. Therefore, gradient vanishing or explosion may become more likely, and so on. So we need to be aware of these issues. Then is the parallelism constraints. Recursive neural nets suffer uh, enhanced parallelism because the computations are interdependent, and interdependency because of the parents and the children combining to become parents and so on. This basically limits batch level parallelism and model level mapping to parallel hardware. Now the tree shapes are also dynamic, that like increases the problem further because there is no uniformity. So as a consequence, most of the hardware, as I mentioned earlier, it remains underutilized, which reduces the throughput. Then is the high latency. Now combining that overhead, which is the traversal overhead, then node by node recursion, then the function call overhead, then the dynamic dispatch, all of this results in significant inference and delays in training. Now in a real-time remote learning system, this means slower response to to like dynamic changes or changes in the environment states. So that does not make them very attractive. Then is the memory overhead. Now, since we are using recursion to support gradient-based learning, all intermediate nodes and states must be stored. That requires memory. So, in reinforcement learning with many time steps and parallel episodes, memory demands kind of increase exponentially. And then the dynamic graph structures and memory fragmentation adds the extra cost. So, this is very memory intensive. So, that's expensive. And then finally, we have the structural rigidity. So, what is structural rigidity? Recursive neural nets often assume a predetermined or limited tree shape. Say, for example, binary trees. Here, I gave you the example of a tertiary of a tree with 3 degree. Now, in real world hierarchy changes, it is k area, k could be 4, 3, 5, whatever. It's non-trivial to adapt the structure dynamically because if you try to do so, that may require initialization, which is very expensive, or graph modifications, which are equally expensive. So if there is misalignment between the assumed and actual structures, that reduces the effectiveness of representation. That also makes transfer across domains with different hierarchies harder. So there are quite a few challenges, and we have gone through those challenges. But if those challenges are taken into consideration, then it's a very viable choice. And here are the details for you to cover. And here are the references for further reading.